further ado, let's get into review. So I've condensed the 4 steps of the case interview that we've been talking about these last 2 meetings into really one slide. So again, what a case interview is you're essentially role playing with the interviewer as if you are in a client engagement, right? So your interview is the client and you are the consultant. So we can break this down into 4 steps, as we've talked about. The prompt, where you take notes on what the problem is and the background information. You summarize this back to the interviewer, so to make sure you have all the information. And then lastly, in an optional part, you ask clarifying questions, just in case you're confused about anything that was in the prompt. And then next, we have the frameworking part. So this is where you take a minute to collect your thoughts and you bucket your ideas into groups or categories that you believe are important to solving the problem or important to examining the problem. You would present this to the interviewer, and then you would push the case forward from there. So you would select the bucket, right? So say, for example, profitability, you would select the profitability bucket, say, this is the most likely place where you think the case is going, or the most likely place to get data. And then you would say, okay, do we have any data, for example, on the revenue of the products or something like that? Then that would yield you an exhibit. So that brings us to analyzing exhibits. So for each exhibit, you do 3 things. You, 1, walk through the exhibit to the interviewer. So as soon as you see the exhibit, you're saying out loud what you're thinking, right? So you're saying like, oh, on the x-axis, we see this. On the y-axis, we see this. We see the title graph is this. So we can assume that the graph is talking about this, right? And then highlight any important trends. The next thing you do is walk through the math. So usually in exhibits, there's some sort of calculation that you have to do. In interviewer-led cases, usually they'll tell you what math to do. In interviewee-led cases, it's kind of more up to you to determine what the math is. And then lastly, again, like in the frameworking portion, we push the case forward. So based on the calculations that we did previously, is there anything that we need to, or is there any more data that we need? And then lastly, the recommendation, which we said we can break this down into 3 steps. State your solution, so whatever the overarching recommendation is. 2, preface this with risks. So whatever risks, whether it be lack of data or whether it be something that came up in the exhibits, make sure you preface your recommendation with these risks. And then lastly, use next steps as a way to mitigate these risks. So basically, we can mitigate the risks that I previously talking about by pursuing step X next. Cool. Does anyone have any questions on like the specific breakdown of the case before we move on? Okay, cool. So market sizing. So we talked about what a market sizing interview is. It's basically it's basically an estimation question, right? You're trying to estimate whatever like population, whatever revenue figure they're asking for. So I think last time we did like, how much revenue does the Starbucks outside of Stern give, right? And our job was to estimate that number. So a high level breakdown of market sizing is, first, you start with a population or representative sample, right? So for example, like if we were doing a question like how many, like, I don't know, like how many women wear high-heeled shoes in New York City, right? We would start with like a population of 8 million people, because 8 million is the population of New York City. Alternatively, like last time we did how many Chipotles are in New York City. And so what Vina did was she was like, okay, I see X number of Chipotles in this many streets. And then she expanded out that sample to the rest of New York City. And so now the next step is keep segmenting the population down. So once you have a starting population, you want to keep segmenting it in order to achieve like the end result. And then lastly, you want to make sure that you're using actual numbers. So when you're segmenting the population down, you want to assign numbers to those segmentations and then give a qualitative reason as to why you chose that number. Remember, in market sizing, we're not trying to figure out the exact number or whatever the real number is in the world. We're just trying to show the interviewer our thought process and how to get to an end number. Great. So I want to go into a little bit more into segmentation because I don't think it was as clear as it could be in the last presentation. So when you're segmenting the population down, these are the 3 steps you need to take. So first, you make an observation, right? So for example, like let's go back to our how many women or how many people in New York City wear high heels, right? So the first thing you want to do is once you have your starting population, you make an observation, right? So people who generally wear high heels in New York City are women, right? So that would be our observation. Our second step in segmenting would be adjusting that population that we had, right? The 8 million people in New York City with numbers, right? So based on this observation that we make, we can cut down the population of New York City by 50% to get us 4 million people. And then you want to justify that number. So why are you cutting down the number by 50%? We're cutting down the population by 50% because women tend to make up half of a given population, right? So it's really easy. Just every time you segment something, make sure you go through those 3 steps. Cool. Does anyone have any questions on this before we move on? Okay, cool. If you have a question and I don't get to it, or if you're just don't want to like talk in front of the audience, just feel free to write it in the chat and one of our eBoard members will respond to it. Cool. All right, so now let's really get into what's being tested in these technicals. So I have like there's a lot of things being tested in a technical consulting interview. And so I kind of wrote out a laundry list of kind of overlapping attributes that you need. So let's go through them. So the first is, of course, like problem solving, right? The main part of a consultant's job is like solving the client's problem. So of course that they're testing this, right? And you can get it from really like what the types of questions they're asking, right? Like market sizing, the case interview, they're all asking you to solve for something. So that's something that they're really looking for. The second is structure and organization. So you really want to be structured in how you approach these problems. So a lot of what we've been doing in this series is teaching you guys like exactly how to like structure your thoughts, right? And exactly like what to say. So like, for example, in market sizing, right? Like we were like, okay, you should organize your thoughts based on like these 3 factors, right? Make up observation, adjust the population with numbers, and then justify the number, and then keep repeating that process over and over again. The next is thought process. So this really goes more to casing, where anytime you're like thinking something, right, you want to articulate it out loud to the interviewer, right? Because the interviewer wants to see how you think, and they can't see how you think if you're not saying it out loud. The next one is resilience. So this is, I would say, more referring to like when you get something wrong in a case. So like, say for example, you're in the frameworking section, right? And you're picking the wrong bucket. You pick like a bucket that we don't have data on, right? The interviewer will be like, oh, we don't have data on that. Is there anything else that you want to like talk about, or anything else, like any other data that you want, right? And it's really making sure that you don't buckle under that kind of pressure, and you're able to fluidly move on to whatever you think is the next most likely piece of data that you could get. The next one is client interaction. So again, this goes more towards casing, where you're basically simulating a client engagement, right? Where the interviewer is the client, you are the consultant. And so they want to see how you would like basically react, how you would carry yourself in a client engagement, right? Because consulting is a client-facing role, you have clients, so they really want to test for this attribute. The next is stress test. So this goes more towards like, I would say like the math, for example, or if you get something wrong, again, like kind of overlapping with resilience, they're really just trying to, I think, see how you handle stress and how you handle pressure, and that you're able to like kind of bounce back when you're wrong, or basically how you can bounce back when you're wrong. Cool. The next is, so I would say like passion for consulting. So this is something in any interview, whether it be technical or behavioral, that you really want to get across, is this idea that you're like passionate about what you do. So like if possible, like in like a case interview or in a market sizing, kind of like don't be like all serious and look like you don't enjoy being there, right? Like try to like smile a lot during this. Try to make like your interviewer feel like you actually have a passion for the type of work that you're applying for. The next is math skills. So, right, so in casing, in the analyzing exhibits portion, right, you're going to have to be doing math. It's simple arithmetic, right? Like it's nothing fancy, but it's like something that they're really testing for to make sure that you're able to do this. In casing, right, you can write down the math, but in market sizing, you're doing it all out loud, right? So yeah, so that's just the difference between those two. And then the last thing, and I think you could all like assume this, is thinking on your feet, right? So the ability to not go in with like a set framework, not go in with like a set ideas about like how the case should run, but really adjusting to like either nudges that the interview gives you or twists and turns in the case, right? Like if you get an exhibit and the case turns in a completely different direction than you were expecting, the ability to really bounce back, right? And think on your feet in that way. Cool. So does anyone have any questions on these attributes? Or like anything at all about like what's being tested for in casing or in market sizing? Okay, great. Cool. So now let's move on. So now that we know like what the attributes are that are being tested for, how do we stand out? So let's do casing first. So the first thing I would say is in casing, I would tailor your framework. So I'd say a lot of candidates come in with kind of a like pre-worked out framework, right? A framework that kind of like applies to like really any case. I would say one of two things about this. So the first thing is don't be stuck in that framework, right? Like I know we gave like the 3 C's and a P framework for you guys. Don't be stuck in that one framework. Adjust the buckets for the case and to what like the prompt is talking about, right? So like for example, I don't know, like if customers aren't like us particularly like applicable to the case, right? Just don't include it, right? There's no purpose in including that bucket if it's not like part of the case. But if you do have like a good framework that you think can be kind of like work to any type of case, and you want to keep that in your back pocket, how you can avoid basically the interviewer knowing this, that you're coming in with this presupposed framework, is tailor the bucket names, right? So like instead of writing out like company, customer, competition, right? Like tailor the names to the case, right? So instead of company, right? Like write the actual name of the company as the bucket title, right? Instead of competition, say we're like, it's like a restaurant case, right? Like say like the restaurant market or something like that. For like customers, you can say like, if our client is McDonald's, you can say like McDonald's, like people who eat at McDonald's, or McDonald's customers or something like that. This is super important because if you're going to use the same framework in multiple case interviews, like within the same firm, you want to make sure that like they don't think you're coming in with like this like set framework each time. Cool. The next is don't resist nudges. So the interviewer will give you hints, right? If you aren't going in the right direction. So one of the things that you really want to do is make sure you don't get stuck in your own logic. Like a lot of the time in casing, you get this idea of like this really like solid idea of where the case is going, but then all of a sudden the interviewer says that's like not the right way. So instead of like doubling down on that idea and really like saying like, no, I really think we should explore this, like think on your feet, go like in the direction that the interviewer is like pushing you. Cool. The next is, I would say, organize your thoughts with numbers. So what do I mean by that? So again, one of the things that are being tested in casing is structure, right? And how well can you articulate yourself to the client, and how organized is this articulation, right? So whenever you make a claim to your interviewer, a good structure that I always use is like say you're making a claim, right? You would say, I believe X for 3 reasons. 1, like, and then I would say reason 1. 2, then I would say reason 2, and 3, like reason 3. And therefore, like whatever your claim is, or whatever the conclusion of like the claim is. This is just a really good way of like organizing yourself and to like fall back, like if you're like lost in your thoughts, it's a really good way of like quickly organizing yourself on the spot. So I'd always recommend like doing some sort of structure when you speak. Cool. And also, so another point I want to make is consider things that might not be in the case. So what exactly I mean by that is, in your and like when you get like better at casing, right? And you have like more time like to write your framework down, you can get a lot of stuff down. Um, you could write down things that you don't necessarily think is like the most likely place the case is going, just to show, but like still pertains to the case or still pertains to the problem, just so you show your interviewer that you're like really comprehensively thinking about this problem. I'll give you an example, right? Like in profitability cases, I believe, right, a lot of the time, like I could get away with like just writing a profitability bucket down, right? Because I know for a fact, like in a profitability case, there's going to be data on revenue and costs, and I can easily get an exhibit on that, right? But I'm not just only going to write down that one bucket. I'm going to write down other buckets to, one, like hedge myself, right? Just in case like there is no data on revenue and costs. But two, to also show the interviewer that I'm very like comprehensively thinking about the problem. So like he sees that I'm not just like coming in with like, oh, like I know exactly where this case is going because I've been like preparing a lot. Really like tailoring the case. Cool. The next step I would say is, if you get stuck, right, you don't want to like sit there and freeze up, because like from my experience in casing, like especially in the beginning part, you can really get like stuck and like idea where the case is going. And remember, one of the things that they're testing for is the ability to think on your feet, the ability to like not just like stand there and like freeze up. So a good tip that I use is, if I get really stuck, I always refer back to my framework, right? Because I probably wrote like 2 to 3 other buckets that I haven't even touched on yet in the case. And so I'll probably say like, oh, do we have any data on this bucket or any data on like this bucket, the ones that I didn't use. And then lastly, draw on outside knowledge, right? So if you have background knowledge on what the case is about, like if it's like an oil and gas case and you have all this background information on oil and gas or something like that, right? Like incorporate that in your framework, incorporate that in like risks and next steps, really in places where like you can like bring in outside knowledge without it being like a detriment to the case. And you're just showing your interviewer, right, that you're coming in with like all this knowledge, you're coming in with all this outside knowledge, and you're really studied up on this particular industry, which I think is like a cool plus, a cool way to stand out in the interview. Great. So these are like kind of 6 tips that I have. Does anyone have any questions on these particular tips before we move on? Okay, great. So I know that one thing people are really worried about, and I see this from like CCC and FLP interviews, is like the math portion, right? Especially in market sizing, or like where you have to like all do it in your head, or in casing where you get really like weird percentages. So actually, I want to bring in Chirag, our assistant director of CCC, to tell you really like kind of the best math tricks that you can apply to make sure that you don't get these math questions wrong.
Sure. So these are like the 4 that I use the most. And the first one is the percentage swap rule, which is like really cool if you're not familiar with it. It's basically saying that X% of Y is Y% of X. And the reason this works is because whenever you're finding a percentage of something, you're just multiplying the 2 numbers and then moving the decimal place 2 places. So like, for example, if we have 28% of 75, that could be a little tricky to calculate at first, but we could easily switch it to 75% of 28 and then just go from there. 25% of 28 is 7 multiplied by 3 is 21. And we could approach the question so much more easier. Another good strategy is to break numbers down. And that basically means that you want to separate them by place value so you have easier numbers to work with. So for example, if we have 23 times 25, instead of multiplying it out and like having to spend a lot of time thinking about what place is where, et cetera, we could separate it into 2 separate problems, 23 times 20, and then 23 times 5. So that's so much easier, right? We can say 23 times 20 is 460, and 23 times 5 is 115, and that gives us 575. A next one, it would be calculating annual salary. This is not as like commonly used as the other 2, but it's still a really handy trick to have. So this says that your annual salary to calculate it, you could just take the hourly salary and multiply it by 2,000. And the reason this works is that if we assume 52 weeks in a year, and if somebody approximately works for 50 weeks, given 2 weeks maybe vacation, and we have 40-hour work weeks, we have 50 times 40 is 2,000. So if you ever want to calculate the annual salary, you could skip all those steps in the middle, just multiply your hourly salary by 2,000, and that will give you your annual salary. So for example, if we have someone working for $27 an hour, in a year, they'll make approximately $54,000 using that approximation. The final rule is really cool. It's called the rule of 72. And that basically means that when you divide 72 by a growth rate of an investment, it'll give you the time the investment takes to double. So for example, if the growth rate is 8%, the investment will double in 9 years. And what's super cool about this rule is that it's not only applicable to financial terms. We could also have like a population that's growing by 8% a year. And by the same logic, it's going to double in 9 years. So you can extrapolate this rule to many different circumstances, and it really helps you get a better grasp on numbers that the interviewer may throw at you. But yeah, these are 4 metrics that are really useful, and they're really easy to remember and can come in handy during your case interviews.
Cool, thanks. Does anyone have any questions for Chirag on the math rules? Okay, cool. Yeah, definitely take a picture of this slide. It'll be really helpful for your casing math. Also, another trick that I use, this isn't more of a math trick, more of an organizational trick, is kind of tabularize your formulas. So for example, you'll notice like you'll have like multiple exhibits in a case, and sometimes it's really hard to keep track of like what numbers were what formulas were what. So like one thing you can do is like anytime you're doing a calculation, you can like put it in a table and then label like each like column or row based on like what the units are and like what you're doing. And this really just helps you stay organized, right? Especially for when you get to like the recommendation portion of the case, you really want to look back and try to like find what their supporting evidence is for that like solution working. And a lot of the times it's going to be in the math. Great. So now I want to bring in some of our e-board members who have recruited for consulting and kind of ask them what made them stand out in their interview. And so I've asked them to give 1 tip each. So starting with James, do you want to share your tip?
Yeah, sure. So my tip is, if you're having trouble with an approach that you initially decide on, and this is especially true for casing, don't just try to stay to that one approach, especially if you're getting some negative feedback from the interviewer. Always be ready to adapt, and always make sure that if the interviewer or the flow of the interview is trying to guide you in direction, that you're ready to go along with that. As an example, when in one of my case interviews, I was originally thinking that it was mainly a profitability issue. But then I realized that it wasn't really about the profitability of the market. It was more about how we wanted to go about entering that market. And so it wasn't really about the success possibility. It was more about the approach. And so, after I kind of realized that my initial approach was wrong and what I considered initially wasn't the correct approach, I ended up going towards a different direction. And so be ready to kind of adapt and be ready and pay attention to a lot of the visual and audio cues that your interviewer might be giving you, whether it be body language or specifically trying to guide you in the right direction, and kind of be ready to tailor what you're saying and how you're approaching the problem based on that. I think unfortunately Anjali wasn't able to make it today, but I'll cover her tip as well. Her tip is to make sure to be personable, and even though it's a technical interview, make sure that your delivery is comfortable and confident. This is especially important for consulting, even more so than it may be for banking, primarily because consulting is a lot more small team oriented as well as client facing, especially for entry-level associates and analysts. And so because you're working in an extremely small team and because it's focused a lot on the personal relationships of a client services role, One of the primary factors, as Nick mentioned before, that consultants really screen for is whether or not you are personable and whether or not you're somebody that would fit within the culture of the firm and somebody that would get along with professionals at the firm. There's a rule that a lot of consultants say, which is, could I spend 7 hours at an airport during a layover with this person? And the reason consultants consider it from this perspective is that, especially pre-COVID and likely after COVID as well, a lot of consultants did have to spend that much time with each other at an airport if they did have layovers. And so you're really trying to look for people that you think you could get along with as well as work together with. But getting along with and your personality is extremely important as well. Vanessa?
Yeah, so my tip is focused on, in terms of the casing, remembering the objective and always tying what you say back to the objective. And I know that really seems intuitive for probably a lot of people here, but I think sometimes when you're going about the case and you're really down in the details, it can be easy to forget what the actual point of the case is. So tying it back to the objective really manifests in two different ways. I think, of course, in the actual framework itself, making sure that all the points that you're bringing up actually matter to the case. So if the case is focusing on profitability, I don't think it's enough just to say, oh, I would want to look into competitor product line or our client's employee staffing model. I think it's important to draw the connection in terms of, oh, I want to look into the competitor product line to see if they're optimizing for pricing or features that our client is not, which is driving down our profitability overall. Or I want to examine the client's employee staffing model because maybe there are ways to cut down on costs without having to lay off any people. So that's kind of the first way where you can tie back to the objective and focusing on the impact of why what you're saying matters. And the second component of that is really being able to drive the case forward by remembering the objective. So for example, if you have a math situation and you've finally just did all your math and you have an answer, not just saying the number itself, but also contextualizing it back to the objective of, is this significant for the client? Is this still something that they need to improve upon? So focusing on those two components are some great things you can keep in mind moving forward.
Cool, great. Thanks, James and Vanessa. So while we have you guys, these are two really successful people, both in recruiting for consulting and both in their internships. So does anyone have any questions like about their experiences in recruiting or in the interview process that they want to ask right now? Okay, cool. So we'll stick around at the end just in case there are questions that people don't want to ask quite right now. But yeah, so I want to talk about, all right, cool. So now that we've talked about how to stand out in casing, let's move to the market sizing portion and how we can stand out in this specific technical question. So the first thing, and this is something we covered last time, was don't get overwhelmed, right? So again, in interviews of what I've seen, the number one reason why people do badly is because they like freak out when they hear the market sizing question, right? They're either like really freaked out about trying to get like the exact answer, or they just like don't know where to begin. I don't think this should be a problem for you guys because I've kind of, through the last session and then also the review at the top, we kind of know how to structure these responses and know how to at least start them. So that's not something that I think should concern you. But I also think it's like a really good way to stand out, right? Like a lot of the times, I don't know, like I haven't done like firm interviews, of course, but I've done like given interviews for FLP and like CCC. And one of the things that really stood out to me as an interviewer was like being calm and collective when you first hear this market sizing question, and then being able to like get off to a good start. And usually the people who are like calm and collective at the beginning tend to do well throughout the rest of the question. So definitely something I would suggest doing. The next one is make your segmentation granular. So I included this because in last session, when we were doing the market sizing, I noticed that some people were kind of making like really big jumps. So I know the question was like, what's like how much revenue does the Starbucks outside of Stern bring, right? And so people were already, I think, like jumping to like, okay, like how many people they think are in that coffee shop, like at a given time or something like that. I'd say like, don't make like super broad jumps like that. Like a good place to start would probably be like, okay, like what's the surrounding population of that like Starbucks, right? And you can say it's like, oh, it's NYU students and there's this many NYU students. And then you can be like, oh, but like out of these NYU students, some of them are like in the Shanghai campus, some of them are like abroad, like doing abroad stuff. So we can cut down that number a little bit more. And like we can keep making the segmentation a little like more granular like that. Because one, it shows the interviewer that we're thinking like very comprehensively about how to segment the population down. But also two, we're getting a more accurate answer, right? Because we're not making like these huge like leaps in logic. I want to preface this by saying like, don't spend too much time on like segmenting. So don't like overly segment it where like you're sitting there for like 15 minutes trying to just like get how many people are in like the surrounding Starbucks or like how many people go into Starbucks. So just like keep that in mind. And I think this really brings me to my next point, which is preface your method with risks. So if you thought of any other considerations, like any other ways that you could have like better segmented the population down that you left out, and it's kind of like either too late to go back to it, or for time reasons, you really want to just keep pushing forward, you can state these reasons at the end. So like when I get like my final number, like say of like, oh, okay, I think the Starbucks outside of Stern brings around like $100,000 like a day based on my calculations, right? And I say like, oh, okay, but like, I think I can preface this assumption with, I think I can preface this answer with like this consideration that I could have factored in, or like this adjustment that I could have factored in, right? So again, it's really like, it's one, like covering yourself, right? Just in case you forget, like when you're doing the market sizing itself. But also two, and again, it's showing this interviewer this like, you have this more comprehensive understanding of the problem. You're really thinking it through, and it saves a little bit on time because you're not having like to do the math exactly, right? You're just saying like, oh, at the end, like I can make these like few adjustments. Don't have like a lot of adjustments though, right? Like with risks, we always want to be sparing in how many we give, because if we give like 20 risks, then like what was the point of your methodology in the first place? So give like one or two maybe. The next one I would say is interact with the interviewer. So this goes to one Anjali's point, right? Where is you kind of want to be like personable, show the interviewer that like you're someone that they can like sit in like an airport with for like a really long time. But also too, if you make assumptions, which you will be doing in market sizing, or if like you don't know, for example, what the starting population is, you can ask the interviewer for like to like, oh, can I make this assumption? Or like, oh, I'm not really familiar with New York City. Could you tell me whatever the population of New York City is? This is really good because one, you can incorporate their feedback, but also two, you can keep their attention. So like, I feel like a lot of the times, and you might notice this like when you're like interviewing people for whatever club you're in, sometimes like your attention like after like multiple interviews starts to kind of waver. So when you're like prompting the interviewer with like questions throughout your answer, and like make sure that their attention is like staying with the answer, right? And they're not kind of like dozing off of like what they're like going to eat for lunch or like what they're going to do next. So that's a really good tip. Okay, the next tip, give the illusion you're good at math. So what do I mean by this? So I know like myself included, right? Like I'm not like super good at like mental math or anything, right? But one way to kind of like trick your interviewer into thinking you're good at math is just to use like easily to divide numbers, right? Like don't do like you take like 2 million, like 200,000 and do like 78.65% of that, right? Make it easier on yourself. Use like easy like percentages, use easy like population numbers. And this will all make sure that you're able to like seamlessly get through the math and give this like perception that you're good at doing the math. Cool. And then the last thing is, and this is similar to casing, right? Draw on your personal experience. So a lot of the times in market sizing, you can use like observations from your regular life as like qualitative reasons or like qualitative reasoning to back like the assumptions that you're making. So for example, like with our Starbucks question, right? I would say like, one of the things that I could do is like, oh, I study in that Starbucks every day for a few hours. And then like in that time, I see like the baristas make X number of drinks. And then like, that's like a good way of like drawing in like your personal experience. Like that doesn't technically have to be true. But it's like good reasoning to back up your assumptions. Cool. Does anyone have any questions about this? This is the last kind of like how to stand out slide before we go into implementing this into practice. So any question on this or any of the other tips that we gave? Okay, cool. All right, so let's try a market size example. So I picked a very topical market size for this session. So how many packs of surgical masks are sold in New York City every day? So I want to do this more as a group exercise, not just me like giving you a demo of what this should look like, because we did that last session. So where do you guys think we should start with this?
Maybe the population of New York City?
Yeah, perfect. The population of New York City. We don't have to give numbers for this just to make it easier and so everyone interacts a little bit more. So cool. So we start with the population of New York City. Now, how would we like segment that down further?
We can do demographics. We can do age groups or a profession, segregated by profession kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. So gotcha. So segmenting by like demographics is usually like a good idea. But do you think there is any like differentiation in terms of like people who wear masks between like different age groups? Like assuming everyone is like smart, which is like, okay, big jump, right? Like, and wears masks when they're supposed to. Do you guys think like that like certain age groups like would not be wearing masks and certain age groups would be wearing masks?
Could you clarify if surgical masks means like our everyday masks or like doctors N95 style masks?
Yeah, so what I mean by surgical masks are like those like, you know, like those blue masks, like the blue, like the ones you get in hospitals, but also like the ones that people wear out kind of now. They're like the disposable ones that come in like the big packs. Okay, so like let's take a beat for a second. So in the question, right, we're asking about like a specific type of mask, right? So like, let's make an assumption, right? Like we know the population of New York City. We're going to say everyone in New York City wears masks, right? Which is a big jump in logic, but let's assume that, right? How many of those people do you think are wearing surgical masks? I think that's a good question to ask yourself.
Maybe half? Assume half have gotten reusable masks?
Yeah, sure. So let's say like half are like 50% of people are wearing surgical masks. Cool. And so like, what would your reasoning be for that?
I'm assuming that a certain percentage would have gotten reusable masks, a certain percentage would have gotten like face shields and stuff, but like the blue masks are still very cheap and very common.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's cool. That's perfect reasoning, right? So you're saying like, oh, okay, there's like all these different types of masks, but because of like their like wide availability and because they're like really cheap, I'd say like 50% of people would wear surgical masks. Another cool thing that you could do is like, you could be like, okay, on my like walk to school, right? Like I see like at like half the people who walk by me like wear surgical masks and like half the other people wear like N95s and like K95s and things like that, right? So that's another way you can do it. Cool. So we have now, right, the number of people who wear surgical masks in New York City. Where would we go from here?
How long one pack of surgical masks last?
Yeah, perfect. How long one surgical mask lasts, right? So how would you figure that out?
like the number of surgical masks in one pack.
Mhm.
And then if we are assuming that those are disposable masks, so we wear it once, like one mask we wear it per day. So
Mhm.
if we assume like 10 masks in one pack,
Mhm.
then one pack lasts for 10 days.
Yeah, perfect. Cool. So now we have, right, like how long each pack of masks lasts for. So we have number of people who wear surgical masks, and then also, right, like how long these packs last for. So let's bring it home, right? How would we answer the question based on like those two numbers? I'm not asking for
Divide
a specific number, by the way, but yeah, sorry, go ahead.
divide the total number of people who wear surgical masks by the duration.
Mhm. Yeah, perfect, right? So we're averaging the like how many people wear like surgical masks by like how long they're usable for, or like how long each pack would last for, and that would get us to like a rough estimate of like how many packs of masks are sold each day. So perfect. So that was actually a really clean market size. Pretty impressed. So as everyone was doing again, right? They were one, like saying like, okay, I think we should segment the population by this. They were making good granular assumptions, right? So like, you're not jumping to like, oh, okay, like how many packs of surgical masks are sold in New York City? And then they were like, oh, like there's like 10 or something like that, or something, right? You're like really like getting granular in your segmentation. And then also, right, you're making qualitative assumptions to back up your reasoning. So like if I'm going to cut the population by 50%, I have to give justification, right? And I think someone gave really good justification where it was like, oh, okay, like the masks are like cheap and like widely available. So that's why I'm assuming 50%. Cool, perfect. So now that we've done the market size, I kind of want to move on for the remainder of the session to a case. So for this case, it's a lot more comprehensive than the one we did before. There's a lot more exhibits. So definitely want to see how you guys fare with this, incorporating the tips that we used. Again, we're going to do this as a group exercise, so we're not going to do this in breakout rooms. We'll do it together. So cool. Does anyone have any questions, by the way, on the market size? I didn't stop to ask you that.
Yeah, I was wondering, do we consider the commercial demand for surgical masks, like the demand by the hospitals? Because here we are just assuming the people.
So that's actually a really good way of like prefacing your like methodology, right? So like, right, we didn't think about, right, that there's like commercial applications, but also like, right, like the like hospital applications, right? And like we would say like, oh, hospitals probably go through a lot more reusable masks, right, than like one a day per doctor. So that's something you can either include in the original market size, like when you're going through it, or if you think about it later, like how we just did now, you can preface it and be like, oh, okay, but like one risk to this methodology is we didn't really account for like the hospitals that probably go through a lot more. And so I'd adjust this number using like this method. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool. Anyone else? Okay, great. So let's start on the case. So for those of you who are like following along, it'd be really great if you could pull out like a piece of paper and a pencil, practice, like I'll read the case aloud, practice taking notes. I'm not gonna like take the prompt off the screen, but when we get into the exhibits, I'm not gonna have it on. So in case you wanna like further follow along, it'd definitely be good. Cool. So a large auto insurance company, Auto Drivers, is exploring telematics and has identified whether OBD, onboard diagnostics, or a mobile solution is the right fit for them. Telematics is defined as the convergence of informatics and telecommunication to transmit data. Think about Fitbit or OnStar, which collect and use data to deliver additional services to customers. With telematics, auto drivers can capture driving data and use it to better price insurance premiums. The company hopes that using telematics will enable it to enroll new customers and reverse its decline in market share. The company has hired you to identify which telematic strategy is the right fit for them. The company is also interested in understanding how it can increase its engagement with customers and provide them with additional services. Specifically, they are interested in growing in states where auto drivers has a low brand perception. Cool. So does anyone want to try summarizing the prompt for me? Or summarizing like the important information? Okay, if that's too much, right? Like, let's say like, okay, what do you guys think is, let's break this down, right? So we have like company background information. What do you guys think is like the most important background information of this case?
Declining market share? I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. No. I was thinking about the declining market share.
Perfect. So right. So this isn't necessary. Yeah. So decline in market share. Yeah. So that's a good background for the information. Really sets up like the problem that they're trying to solve. What else? What are they interested in? This company.
Seeing if a new strategy will work for them or not.
Yeah. What's the new strategy?
Of the
Customer engagement and additional service.
So that's not the specific strategy. That's more of like what they're trying to do with the strategy. Like, what's the strategy itself?
Oh, okay.
Using telematics.
Yeah, good, David. So yeah, so they want to implement a telematic strategy, right? So like how I would go about summarizing this case is I'd be like, okay, so our client is auto drivers, and they're interested in exploring a telematic solution, and they have two solutions for us, OBD and mobile. And then I would be like, they're using this strategy to help reverse its decline, the company's decline in market share. And they've asked us to figure out whether mobile or OBD is a better solution based on like, one, would it reverse this decline in market share? Two, would it help them grow in states where auto drivers has a low brand perception? And then also three, right, increase engagement with its customers and provide them with additional services. So that's probably like the important information I'd pick out, right? So like the name of the company, what they're trying to do, what the strategy they're trying to implement is, why they're trying to implement it, what are they asking from us? Cool. Does anyone have any like questions about that? Okay, cool. Notice how I didn't like kind of specifically say like what telematics is, like in this, like it's not like important kind of information if you already have like an understanding of what it is. But okay, cool. What's after we take important information on the prompt? What's like the optional thing that you can do?
ask for more data.
So not quite yet. So we want to ask for specific data after the frameworking. But that's a good idea. We're asking something. What are we asking?
Any clarifying questions about the prompt?
Yeah, perfect. Clarifying questions about the prompt. So does anyone have any confusion about the prompt and what they're trying to do?
Yeah. In the second slide, it says something about they want to know which telematics strategy is right for them. Is there like a specific set of strategies we're supposed to be looking at, or is it just?
Yeah, so the two strategies are OBD, so onboard diagnostics, or a mobile solution. So those are the two strategies. Something I would ask is like what the hell is telematics, right? Like I don't know what that is. Like the convergence of like informatics and telecommunication, like that's just a bunch of like words. So something I would ask is like, can you like explain kind of like more in depth what telematics is? Basically, it's like they're trying to price insurance premiums, right? They're trying to see how safe people drive. So they're like, should we collect data through putting like a machine, like a piece of hardware in someone's car, which would be OBD, or would it be like better to like download an app and then they'll collect data from like a person's phone about how safe they drive. And then using this data, they can better price their insurance premiums. Cool. All right. Frameworking portion. Where do you, so I'm not going to ask you guys to do a whole framework out, but based on like what you guys have read, where are you going to ask data from, or what do you think is the most likely place for data? I've accidentally showed the slide like 3 times right now, or 3 times before. So if anyone's seen it, they can just say it. Right, so we're trying to figure out whether we should pursue OBD or we should pursue mobile, right? What would tell us whether we should pursue like whatever solution?
I'm not sure if we could make a full category, but we maybe like want the barriers to entry, like how much it costs to implement OBD versus the mobile solution.
Yeah, perfect. So cost is really good. I'm gonna press you on that a little bit, okay? So like what else besides cost? Like what's on the other side of the profitability equation?
How like to supply like the revenue you'd get from each, or like the benefit, like how useful it is, I mean like how accurately you could price it.
Nice. So yeah, perfect. So we do have data on that, right? So does anyone want to help me walk through this exhibit or tell me what this exhibit is showing? So remember in casing, right? Like we don't want to like freeze up, not say anything to the interviewer. We want to like start going and like telling us what we see.
I mean, I can just keep going, I guess. Yeah. So this exhibit is just comparing some data between OBD and the mobile solution. Mm-hmm. We see that the mobile solution has double the market size, but half the market share. Mm-hmm. It has no variable marketing cost and only half the equipment cost as OBD. It gives us 5,000 revenue compared to 2,000. That's like 150%, I think, as double the customer adoption rate. The technological development locations are different. OBD is in America, but mobile solution is abroad. And the cost of technological development is about a bit over double for the mobile solution.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool, perfect. Really good job. So you walked me through like what kind of like each column was talking about. So few things. What I would change is like one, probably say like what overall like the exhibit's talking about. So it's like what you asked for, right? Like it's like, oh, okay, we see that we're comparing OBD and mobile solution across a bunch of different factors, right? And then you would probably like go into like each of the factors like you did. And it was really good that you explained to me kind of like the trends that you saw in the data, right? Like you just didn't like list out all the numbers in the data, like you just told me what the important trends were. That was really good. So, okay, cool. So now that we have this exhibit, what calculation should we do? That's the next question we have to ask ourselves. So, right, it's like, what are we trying to solve for, right? We're trying to figure out whether auto drivers should pursue an OBD in a mobile solution, right? And we have a bunch of financial data about like each solution.
So revenue minus cost for each?
Yeah, perfect. So like, what are you trying to do when you're like taking revenue minus costs? Like what
Profit.
Huh?
Profit.
Yeah, profit. Perfect, right? We want to find the profitability of each solution. Okay, cool. I'm not going to ask everyone to like do the math, right? But just tell me like what the formula would be. Let's take OBD first, right? What's the formula for OBD? Okay, let's break this down, right? So like we know roughly, right? We need to find revenue minus costs, right, to get profitability. So we have like market size numbers, right? And so this is really helpful. Like if we know, like we also have like per customer data, right? So it would be kind of helpful to figure out like how many people would use this solution, right? So that's like probably our first step. So how would we figure that out?
So
you go.
Oh yeah, thank you. So given like the market size, we know that if we're focusing just on OBD, there's 10,000 possible consumers, and then so we multiply that by the price per unit, which would be the revenue per customer, which would get us 2,000. So multiplying 2,000 times 10,000 would get us hold on, I don't know how.
David, I'm gonna stop you really quick for a second. So make sure you read the label, right? Like of the chart, right? So what does 10,000 represent?
The potential market size.
Yeah, for what?
Telematics.
For telematics. So not for auto drivers, but of like the entire like telematics industry. So then we have what? Like what's the second
market share?
Right, market share.
Yeah.
So you could clarify, right? Like and say like, oh, what is this the market share for? This is the market share for auto drivers specifically. Yeah, cool. Anything else in the chart that you think would be helpful in determining like the number of customers we would have?
Could you look at the customer adoption rate?
Perfect. Customer adoption rate, right? So, okay, going back to David, right? So we have these three numbers, right? We have the potential market size for telematics as a whole, what auto drivers captures out of that like market, and then out of those people, how many of those customers adopt the OBD solution. So what's the formula for that?
So that would be, I believe, multiplying the market size by market share, which would get us 1,000 specifically for OBD for auto driver, and then you would multiply that by the revenue per customer, which would get you 2 million, and then multiply that by the customer adoption rate, which will get you 500,000.
Gotcha. Perfect. Yeah. So cool. So that's exactly how you do it. What I would say is you could also do it like 10,000 times 10% times 25%, just so you get like the number of people that are doing the solution, that are adopting the solution from auto drivers. Because like, what's the next thing that we have to do? We've calculated revenue. What's the other side of that?
Cost,
right? So we would do the same thing. Does anyone want to tell me how we would calculate costs? You don't have to do the math. It's not like super important. Just like tell me the formula.
Yeah, we could add up the variable costs, multiply that by the number of customers, and add that to the fixed costs.
Yeah, perfect, right? So we would add up the variable costs, multiply that by like the number of people that are adopting the solution. So that's why I said like maybe do 10,000 times 10% times 25% first. Not a big deal if you don't. You can add in that 25% later. Just like the order really doesn't matter. But cool. Okay. So I'm just going to tell you guys how this plays out. So how it plays out is basically like OBD solution, it gives you negative profit, even without like the cost of technological development. The mobile solution gives you like a large positive profit, even including the cost of technological development. Okay, so that's the, we don't need numbers, but that's like the answer. So based on this, right, what's your like preliminary thoughts based on the calculation?
To go with mobile solution?
Yeah, perfect. So what you would say to the interviewer is just purely based on our profitability calculation. We see that the mobile solution is more profitable than OBD. So the mobile solution is probably the most likely strategy that we would implement. Cool. Now, in our case, there were like multiple questions, right? What was one of the other questions besides like which strategy we should implement?
They wanted to figure out how to grow in states that had low brand perception.
Yeah, perfect, Rachel. So where would you say, like how would you push the case forward based on that?
I guess I'd ask first of all to clarify if low brand perception meant a bad impression or just on lack of awareness. And then I guess
you can assume lack of awareness.
Then I guess I'd ask, I'm not sure.
Okay, yeah, no problem. So let's think, right? So the question was, auto drivers wants to grow in states where they have low brand perception, right? So states with low brand perception. So maybe, right? Does anyone else have an idea before I give away the answer?
Look for advertisements in those states, So like their branding strategies and advertisement strategies in those states.
Yeah, so that's good. It's almost there. So right, so we want to know, like, basically we want to know what like data on states there is, like in terms of like one, right, like how would they adopt this telematic solution, right? Because that's ultimately what we want to do. But two, like what's the brand perception we have in like various states, right? Because we want to grow in states, as Rachel said, right, with low brand perception. So we want to know what our perception is across like many different states. So that's what we would do to push the case forward. So really good job, guys. So now we have this exhibit. So does anyone want to quickly walk me through this exhibit?
It looks like a summary of brand perception across 3 states, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. It looks like we have the greatest brand perception in New Jersey, then Maryland, then Pennsylvania. And the exhibit on the left indicates the percent of new customers. On the right indicates, I'm not sure what the scale is on the right, the 0, 5, 10. It doesn't have a label.
Yeah, so you can assume that it's like the percent of people aware of auto drivers.
Okay, so the right is current and then the left is new. I'm sorry. So the left is percentage of new customers interested.
Are you talking about? I'm sorry. Are you talking about which graph are you talking? The left, this graph?
I'm confused on the difference between the two.
Okay, so so read the titles, right? So one is the percent of new customers interested in telematics. The other one is auto drivers brand perception. So how I'd walk through this is be like, okay, so we have some data based on 3 different states, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. If you don't know the acronyms, like you can ask, or the initials, you can ask. But also okay, on the left, we see that this pie chart is talking about the percent of new customers interested in telematics. And we see the highest percent of customers interested is Maryland, followed by New Jersey, then Pennsylvania. On the right, we see auto drivers brand perception. So I guess this is the how people perceive the brand, or how aware people are of the brand in these 3 states. We see Pennsylvania has the lowest, while New Jersey has the highest. And then we also see some blurbs at the bottom. We see that new customers represent the customers who are considering signing up for telematics program provided by auto drivers. Okay, and then we see that brand perception is based on the customer survey, comparing different auto insurance companies and how they are perceived in providing high customer engagement. Cool. So that's exactly how we would walk through these 2 exhibits. So good job, Rachel. So, okay, cool. There's another part to this exhibit. Does anyone else want to walk me through what this exhibit is talking about?
I can try.
Yeah, go for it.
So this exhibit shows the percentage increase in adoption rate. So just to clarify, is the adoption rate for telematics or the telematics specifically by auto drivers?
We can assume that it's for auto drivers specifically.
Okay, so it shows the percentage increase in adoption rate for the telematics by auto drivers, and it roughly shows a linear percentage increase. So in Pennsylvania, over the 3 years, the percentage increase was about 15% increase from, let's say, 5% in year 1 to little over 20% in year 3. For New Jersey, we see about a 5% increase over the 3 years, from 10 to 15%. And for Maryland, we see an increase of 5% from year 1 to year 2, but after that it was a constant increase at 15%.
All right, cool, perfect. So really good job, especially giving me like quantitative backing to what you're talking about. Something I would say is you can make more like qualitative qualitative reasoning. So like you could be like, okay, in Maryland, we see that in year 1, year 2, they're growing, but the growth kind of the adoption kind of stagnates from year 2 on. And then, right, like similarly, we could say the same thing. Like we could say like, oh, okay, New Jersey, right? We see that the New Jersey line kind of has like a less steep slope than compared to Pennsylvania, where they're indicating like Pennsylvania has like a higher rate of adoption than like New Jersey. So that's also something that you can add. Cool. So based on these 2 graphs, as I know it's hard because they're on different pages, but what do you guys think? There's no, I'd say like there's no like calculation that you can do, but like what do you guys think is the next step, or the observation that you can make from these exhibits?
So the increase.
Yeah, sorry, go for it.
So the increase in adoption rate for Pennsylvania is the highest I see over the 3 years, but in the other 2 exhibits, Pennsylvania is on the lowest scale, is on the lowest side. So I would think that increasing, how can I increase the percentage of new customers interested in telematics in Pennsylvania, and the auto driver's brand perception in Pennsylvania? How can I increase these 2?
Okay, so you would say, like, say for example, we can only implement the solution in 1 state. You would pick Pennsylvania as the 1 state to implement the mobile solution in?
Now that you
This
talk about
isn't
it,
me like nudging you in a different direction. This is just like asking you a question blanketly.
can I see the other exhibit once more?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd say I choose New Jersey because it has a constant increase, like a low consistent increase in adoption rate, and it also has the highest brand perception, and roughly roughly somewhere in the middle of the percentage of new customers.
Okay, so cool. So what I would say is think back to the prompt, right? What was the question that we were being asked? Like we were being asked like a bunch of different questions, right? Like one was like, should we pursue mobile or OBD? Another was, what was another one?
There is low brand perception in some states. So how to increase the brand perception?
So specifically, right? And anyone can answer these questions, by the way. I don't want to pick on like one specific person if they don't have the answer. But like they want to grow in states that they have low brand perception in, right? But like in New Jersey, right? Even though that like a lot of people are interested in telematics, right? And even though, right, like we do see like a more like linear growth percentage adoption rate, New Jersey has like a really high brand perception. So this is kind of like disagreeing with like what the client wants to do, which is grow in states with low brand perception. So based on this, does anyone want to tweak his answer? You can also chime in and tweak your own answer. It's fine.
I think pursuing an opportunity in Maryland will be best, since looking at the pie chart on the left, we see that there's 40% of new customers interested in telematics in Maryland. So that means that we know that there are a lot of customers there. And right now we see that on the right chart, see that the brand perception of people in Maryland on this company isn't so high. So there's room for improvement. And then looking at the chart on the next slide, we see that the Maryland curve is kind of flattening out. So we know that there's still room for improvement on the adoption rate percentage as well. So just like the ability for growth in Maryland and the amount of people in Maryland, I think makes it the best choice.
Gotcha. Okay. So there was one like really good support, really good reasoning. The only thing I would say is I think there's a misunderstanding about this exhibit, right? So this is like if auto drivers were to these are projections, right? So like if auto drivers were to occupy one of these states, what would the percent adoption rate look like? So for Maryland, right, we see from year 2 and year 3 that it like kind of stagnates in terms of adoption rate. And then like say we hold this trend over like the next few years, right, in the short term, we would probably also see like the same like flat line, right? Or even like a decline. So do we want to invest in a state that is going to have like kind of this drop off in people who adopt our solution or our product?
Wait, would increasing the brand perception increase adoption rate?
No. So this is like, these are the projections that we have, accounting for all the factors.
Right.
So what I would say, right, is I would say like, and this is what the answer in the case is. I would say like Pennsylvania represents the best opportunity because one, even though Pennsylvania has like a low percent of new customers interested in telematics, it seems to have the highest percent increase in adoption rate over like the projected 3 years in our graph. And then also two, it answers the question of auto drivers' desire to occupy a state that they have low brand perception in, because it has the lowest out of the other two states. So this is like a really like hard, this is like more on the hard side, and like kind of a tricky exhibit. A lot in the instructions of this case, it literally says a lot of people are going to get tripped up on Jersey, just because like it has like a high brand percentage, and then also like it has like a linear increase, and then like it has like a huge percent of new customers interested. But you really want to make sure, and I think the trick to this case is to tie it back to the questions that were asked, right? You want to check off each thing that the client is asking for, right? So not only whether you should apply OBD or mobile, but like what, like also answering the question like they want to expand into states that have low brand perception, and Pennsylvania kind of presents that. Okay, cool. I think if they didn't want to grow in that state, right? Like if they didn't want to grow in states with low brand perception, New Jersey would also be a valid answer, right? Because like be like, oh, okay, they have like a really high brand perception, right? So that's good for business, right? And then also have like a really high percent of new customers interested in telematics. So that's also something that's really good. Okay, cool. And so the next step would be recommendation. So of course you would say like, okay, you would sum it up. You'd be like, okay, so I believe that I believe that auto drivers should implement a mobile solution, specifically in Pennsylvania, because one, mobile solution presents a higher profitability or higher profit than the OBD solution. And then also two, Pennsylvania presents a really good state that has one, high customer adoption rates, but also two, low brand perception, which I know is something that you were really worried about. And then I would preface that with like risks, and then whatever my next steps were. And that's how you would kind of end the case. There was another exhibit in this case, and I'll speak a little briefly. It was talking about pros and cons of the mobile versus OBD solution, which is something we didn't get to. But what the interviewer is testing for is they're going to ask you like, what are the pros and cons? And you're going to list out like probably like 2 pros and 2 cons of like the mobile solution over OBD. But then they're going to keep pressing you for more, and then pressing you for more. And really the point of that is to like stress test you, right? Like, can you keep coming up with like more pros and more cons? So just be aware of that. Make sure you don't give up during that, and you keep like thinking on your feet. And then it'll end when you like pretty much hit all the important pros and cons that they have listed in front of them. Cool. So really great job, guys. Really good engagement. I was really happy overall with how this series went and how you guys were responding to kind of the tips and tricks that we were showing you, as well as how to do casing, how to do market sizing. So I'm really happy with that. So definitely feel free to reach out if you have any questions to the MCG email. And so with that, we are going to end our series.